Ted Bundy was a serial killer, kidnapper, rapist, and necrophile who assaulted and murdered upwards of 30 young women and girls between 1974 and 1978. He would play with the sympathies and kindness of these women, exploiting their trust and feigning charm or charisma before murdering them and defiling their bodies after death. He's been described as a sadistic sociopath and the very definition of heartless evil.
And he's the boy girls are going crazy for.
On January 26, 2019, nearly 30 years after his execution, the Ted Bundy biopic, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to wide critical acclaim. The following month, pop culture news website The Tab released an article detailing the film's major selling point: Zac Efron, former Disney heartthrob, playing the titular role as the infamous Ted Bundy.
This is coming at a time where true crime has never been more popular, particularly amongst young girls and women who have always been the main audience for this sort of thing.
The Jeffrey Dahmer biopic, My Friend Dahmer, was released 2 years ago and starred another Disney hottie, Ross Lynch, as the infamous serial killer. American Crime Story, created by Ryan Murphy, was awarded massive critical acclaim for his detailing of the murder of Gianni Versace, with Darren Criss, former Glee star, playing the deranged Andrew Cunanan. In a similar vein, true crime podcasts have never been more popular, with leading podcast My Favorite Murder coining the term "Stay Sexy, Don't Get Murdered" to directly appeal to their female fanbase. Writers Kaylee Cunningham and Andrea Marks hypothesize, in relation to the true crime podcast phenomenon, that women are attracted to true crime stories and discussions because it's a means of keeping themselves safe, learning about potential threats before they themselves are threatened. Additionally, a large part of it comes down to a morbid fascination, a desire to revel in that we find disgusting. So, with this knowledge of the largely female audience of true crime stories, and their desire to arm themselves with knowledge, why are we casting vicious and brutal serial killers with teenage heartthrobs known for singing and dancing? Why is our association with these actors shifted from safe and unthreatening to the most dangerous a person can get? And why are people suddenly attracted to them?
But really, this is not a new thing at all. This is, in fact, a tale as old as time.
Tale as old as time, true as it can be.
Since the dawn of the Gothic literature genre, writers have had an interest in creating attractive and romantic male leads that were also absolutely terrible people.
Inspired by the leader of the Romantic period, Lord Byron, famous for being attractive, alluring, and yet absolutely awful to everyone he knew, we got our Heathcliffs, our Rochesters, and most interestingly for the cinematic tradition, our Count Draculas. Count Dracula is considered to be the seminal text for that which is attractive and also dangerous.
The sexy serial killer, if you will.
Dracula is dangerous. He not only kills people but turns them into his mindless slaves, and yet people are strangely drawn to him. The book describes him with practically erotic language, and everyone he encounters is entrapped in his charm and charisma, save Professor Van Helsing. This becomes even more interesting in 1931, when previously romantic lead Bela Lugosi is cast as the titular Dracula after portraying the character on stage. The film would be released on Valentine's Day, with an official Universal ad calling the film the story of the strangest passion the world has ever known, and the film would prove to be incredibly successful, especially among female viewers who would send fan mail and love letters to Lugosi.
To me, Count Dracula effectively started the cinematic trope that so many people call evil is sexy, or the homme fatale.
The businessman into murders and executions, the bad boy who's just a little too bad, the troubled romantic who would do anything to be loved, the bookstore clerk with skeletons in his closet, the cute motel guy who likes his mother a little too much, the cannibal.
Unsurprisingly, this particular trope has a lot in common with the Ted Bundy Jeffrey Dahmer issue I discussed a little earlier. But for this video essay, I'd like to focus my discussion on why this casting might be used in a fictional context, and why people, particularly women, might feel drawn to these characters. Because this is a very popular choice. So popular, in fact, that they even occur in some instances outside of film and television.
Horror video gaming occasionally leans hard into the attractive serial killer trope, and female creators have even made content for themselves based entirely off of these tropes.
So there's a desire for it. And I want to know where that desire comes from.
The idea of women being into bad boys, be they rebels without a cause or full-blown serial killers, has been something of wide speculation for a long, long time.
And as often as being attributed to the types of media that we interact with that deliberately make these bad boys sympathetic and viable romantic partners, another large attribute of the pull of the bad boy is just down to a science.
Yes, science!
In a study conducted by Gregory Carter of the University of Durham, it was revealed that some women are naturally more attracted to traits associated with narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. These traits including dominance, self-entitlement, superficial charm, deceit, and a sexually exploitive interpersonal stance. Nicknamed the Dark Triad, Carter presented these traits to a group of 128 female subjects and compared them against a neutral nice guy control. And once tested, Carter proved that most of the women were more drawn and thus attracted to the Dark Triad, traits that so many of our sexy serial killers have.
And this makes things very interesting.
Joe Goldberg, lead in You and the newest addition to our Homme Fatales, is a sensitive hipster who runs a bookstore. He helps his neighbours, he grows tomatoes, and he seems like a nice guy. He's also a selfish sociopath who kills people who get in the way of him and his dream girl. Norman Bates, the titular psycho in the Hitchcock classic, is very similar. Charming, polite, just the right amount of appreciation for his mother. That is until it's revealed that he's a violent schizophrenic with unstable mommy issues and a taste for murdering girls in the shower. Joe and Norman are oppositional to the Dark Triad because on the surface they don't display any of these traits. They seem like genuinely good guys, and their deception and quickly obvious psychopathy is what makes them all the more frightening. Or appealing.
Depending on who you are.
Joe is particularly interesting because, like the later discussed Patrick Bateman, he's the main narrative thrust of the series. He is the centre of his story, and ergo he can control what the audience sees, how they react to the dangers that he encounters. Whether we want to or not, the audience develops an attachment to Joe because he's our means with interacting with the world.
While we can recognise Joe as a bad person, we're positioned alongside him and therefore we sympathise with him because we recognise parts of ourselves in him. Maybe we haven't done the things Joe's done, but we've certainly felt the emotions that he has. With the control nice guy wrapped up in discussion, I think it's time to discuss the opposition.
As previously discussed, the Dark Triad is identified with three key traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Those, along with the traits associated with them, are inherently attractive to women, boiling down to sexual selection, the traits that we desire in a short-term mate, and sexual conflict, how the bad boys sell themselves.
Women can recognise that these traits don't work in long-term relationships, but it doesn't stop them from being attractive in short-term flings. My next triad of case studies exhibit these traits to a degree of near ridiculousness.
Hannibal, in any of his iterations, though NBC's is my particular favourite, is a dangerous, manipulative, cannibalistic psychopath who sees most human life as lesser than his own. But he's also incredibly charismatic and alluring, so much so that he gets away with his crimes for years before he's arrested by the extreme empath Will Graham. In a similar vein, JD, or Jason Dean of Heathers, is a murderous high schooler who manipulates, deceives, and exploits his fellow classmates to achieve his goals of destruction and chaos. But he's also sensitive and artsy, quotes Moby Dick and waxes poetic about his love for Veronica. JD is a particularly interesting character because of his representation as a liminal figure. Ros Cavani describes him as standing on a border between life and death, that which is Machiavellian and what is uncaring. He's uncanny, and that's part of the reason he's so unnerving. Or attractive. The same thing has been said about Dracula, how he interacts between the living and the dead, walks amongst the socialites of London as effectively the undead. And when Ward writes that the liminal is an attractive, if not seductive concept, the idea can easily be tied to the attractive serial killer trope. Hannibal and JD are also incredibly popular in this group, particularly because of the audience's positioning with what are effectively love interests, Veronica and Will Graham. Because we view them through the eyes of those who long to understand them, who can empathise and see deeper than their monstrous surface, we're naturally more inclined to empathise with them as well, especially when we understand their traumatic backstories, their hidden potential, their soft spots for their respective love interests. This sort of characterisation shifts what are horror tropes into a kind of tragedy when we acknowledge that this love cannot exist. Elliot Smith writes that this form of storytelling, the empathy for the monstrous, is appealing because it displays a rare form of male vulnerability, which in turn counters the traits of the Dark Triad. When Hannibal and JD can admit their love for Will and Veronica, they become more attractive as a result.
On the flip side of that,
Patrick Bateman is a narcissistic New York yuppie without empathy or emotion who develops an obsession for brutal sex and violence. German hypothesizes that Bateman works as a character because of his attractive narcissism, because of his superficiality. There isn't anything to his character without it. But despite this superficiality, Bateman is universally recognized as attractive. He's also rich, powerful, and so charming that people instantly trust him, for better or for worse. Bateman, like Joe Goldberg previously, is different from Hannibal and JD because we are positioned alongside him. We experience his story through his eyes. When Bateman is the centre of his story rather than a love interest or villain, like Joe, we can't help but develop an involuntary attraction to him, even if it's just out of morbid fascination. Murray Smith writes about how audiences engage with characters in cinema and focuses some theory on the ideas of the audience insertion through the eyes of the protagonist, effectively demonstrated by Joe and Bateman.
And now, for my favourite.
The Phantom of the Opera is perhaps the textbook and most successful example of the homme fatale, with the show's 30-year running being largely attributed to the appeal of his character. He is dangerous yet gentle, dominant but somehow vulnerable, a genius but also deeply emotionally damaged. He's hypnotic, captivating, and innately human. He kills because of his undying love for Christine, but cares for her so deeply that he lets her go after a display of her selfless kindness. Part of the reason he's a romantic contender in the show is because of Christine's empathy, her understanding of how much he has been damaged and hurt, something some of our other homme fatales play with too. He exhibits all the traits of the Dark Triad, but simultaneously counters them, and the Phantom's largely female audience are super into that.
Not that I would know.
But the West End do display posters of his face with the tagline, "Be seduced," so...
They clearly know who their audience is. To conclude this essay, I must ask a somewhat difficult question. Is this a bad thing? Is it bad for people to be attracted to these sorts of characters?
This is a justifiably complex discussion, and even as a fan of the trope, I can recognise that it's generally applied to attractive white men, a demographic that so often gets sympathised with just because of the racial and gender bias of not only Hollywood, but society itself. Many people get away with crimes because of this bias, and depicting the same thing on screen and seeing fan reception echo the same ideas can be understandably frustrating.
Additionally, the idea of women being attracted to these sorts of characters brings about discourses about whether or not these men are abusive, and if their love interests are being abused. I like to believe that women have the understanding to enjoy these tropes in fiction and not apply them to real life, but still it's worth mentioning.
This is especially problematic when discussed in relation to the casting of attractive men as real serial killers, like the aforementioned Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer biopics. This Hollywood casting glamorizes the heinous acts that these men committed and diminishes the tragedy of the victims, reducing the villainy of these very real criminals to being damaged but debonair men that female side characters can't help but fall for.
These are problems. But do these problems make this entire trope problematic as a whole? I don't personally think so, and I also don't think this trope is ever really going to go away either. But if it does, if we have to wave goodbye to our sexy serial killers, at least we can count that Phantom of the Opera will always be on Broadway.
Well, they encourage your complete cooperation. Send your roses when they think you need to smile. I can't control myself because I don't know how. When they love me for it, honestly, I'll be here for a while. So give them blood, blood, gallons of the stuff. Give them all that they can drink and it will never be enough. So give them blood, blood, blood. Grab a glass because there's going to be a flood. A celebrated man amongst the gurneys. They can fix me proper with a bit of luck. The doctors and the nurses, they adore me so, but it's really quite alarming, 'cause I'm such an awful fool.